November 1944, 30,000 feet above the German countryside. A young pilot from Kansas is flying his P-51 Mustang, escorting a formation of B-17 bombers toward their target. He has flown 37 missions. He has seen friends die. He thinks he has seen everything this war can throw at him. Then something appears on the horizon. Something moving faster than anything he has ever witnessed. No propeller, no visible means of thrust. Just a sleek shape with swept wings, closing the distance at a speed that makes his own aircraft feel like it is standing still. Before he can react, the shape tears through the bomber formation. 4 bombers begin to fall, trailing smoke and fire. The thing that killed them is already a dot on the horizon. Untouchable, unreachable. The pilot does what any fighter pilot would do. He pushes his throttle forward and gives chase. His commanding officer's voice crackles through the radio, sharp and urgent. Break off pursuit immediately. Do not follow. Return to the bombers. The order makes no sense. American pilots do not run from the enemy, but this order will save his life. Because the aircraft he was chasing, the Messerschmitt Me 262, is 120 miles per hour faster than anything in the Allied arsenal. Chasing it is not bravery, it is suicide. This is the story of the first jet fighter to see combat. The aircraft that made American commanders issue an order no pilot wanted to hear. The weapon that arrived too late to save Germany, but changed aviation forever. It was the most dangerous aircraft in the sky, and one of the least reliable machines ever sent into combat. That paradox defined everything that followed, the impossible speed. To understand why American pilots were forbidden from chasing the Me 262, you must first understand the mathematics of aerial combat in 1944. Every engagement came down to speed, altitude, and position. A faster aircraft could choose when to fight and when to run. A slower aircraft had no such luxury. The P-51D Mustang, the finest American fighter of the war, had a maximum speed of 437 miles per hour. The P-47 Thunderbolt could reach 440. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning topped out at 414. These were excellent aircraft. They had helped America achieve air superiority over Europe. The Me 262 flew at 540 to 559 miles per hour. This was not a margin advantage. This was a chasm that no amount of pilot skill could overcome in level flight. If you were behind an Me 262 and it did not want you there, you would never catch it. You could push your throttle to the firewall, burn through your fuel, strain your engine to destruction, and the German jet would simply pull away, growing smaller until it vanished. John Murphy was a P-51 pilot with the 359th Fighter Group. He encountered his first Me 262 in the autumn of 1944. His reaction captured what every Allied pilot felt in that moment. He later recalled that his first thought was that he was standing still. The jet seemed to be moving at an impossible velocity. He said it seemed hopeless to attempt to overtake them, but he tried anyway, driven by a curiosity to get as close as possible. Murphy was lucky. He survived his curiosity. Many did not. The problem extended beyond mere speed. The Me 262 carried 4 30mm Mk108 cannons. Each shell weighed 330 grams and contained 85 grams of high explosive. Against a B-17 heavy bomber, only 4 hits were required to bring it down. Against fighters, a single hit was often fatal. The American .50 caliber machine guns required 20 to 25 hits to achieve the same effect. German pilots had developed a simple tactic: approach the bomber formation from the rear at high speed, open fire at 600 meters, hold the trigger for 2 seconds, break away before the escorts could react. The entire attack lasted perhaps 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, 4 bombers could die. The numbers tell the scale of the problem. In March 1945, the 8th Air Force was losing an average of 16 heavy bombers per day to all causes. On the worst days, Me 262 attacks accounted for as many as 12 of those losses in a single engagement. American intelligence estimated, perhaps conservatively, that a well-trained jet pilot could destroy 3 bombers per mission if left unmolested. These were worst-case projections rather than observed averages, but they were projections that kept commanders awake at night. The mathematics were terrifying. If Germany could put 300 Me 262s in the air simultaneously, and each destroyed just 2 bombers per day, the entire American strategic bombing campaign would become unsustainable within weeks. The bomber crews knew this. The fighter escorts knew this. And the commanders in England knew they needed new tactics, because the old ones were getting their men killed. One of the first widely acknowledged jet fighter engagements occurred on July 26, 1944. Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber attacked an RAF Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft near Munich. The Mosquito escaped, but the message was clear. High-flying Allied aircraft were no longer safe anywhere over the Reich. The first Me 262 destruction by American forces came on August 28, 1944. Major Joseph Myers and Lieutenant Manfred Croy of the 78th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts, forced the jet into evasive maneuvers at low altitude, where its handling limitations proved fatal. The German pilot, Hieronymus Lauer, survived. It was an inauspicious end for a revolutionary aircraft, brought down not by superior technology, but by the simple physics of energy management in a turning fight. Eugene Jensen was a B-17 waist gunner with the 100th Bomb Group. On March 8, 1945, his formation came under Me 262 attack. He described the moment in terms that capture the terror these aircraft inspired. The jet flew through their already tight formation so close that they could see the pilot, the rivets in the aircraft's skin, and the 30mm cannon firing. The wing of their lead aircraft was cut free from the rest of the aircraft almost as if by a giant chainsaw, and the aircraft began its lethal tumble to earth. They saw no parachutes. Jensen's account reveals why the Me-262 terrified bomber crews in ways that conventional fighters never had. The attack came too fast to react. The damage was too severe to survive. One moment, you were flying in formation. The next moment, your friends were dead, and the thing that killed them was already gone. The order that saved lives. The evolution of American anti-jet doctrine came primarily from one man. Colonel Irwin Dregne commanded the 357th Fighter Group, a unit that would eventually score 18.5 confirmed. Me Too, 62 kills, more than any other group in the 8th Air Force. Dregne was not a glory hunter. He was a mathematician who understood that winning meant keeping more of his pilots alive than the enemy killed. His initial analysis in December 1944 established what would become standard doctrine. Dregne discovered that a flight of 4 P-51s could box in an Me-262 and prevent it from evading, but only under specific conditions. The Mustangs needed initial advantage of altitude and position. They needed numerical superiority of 4-1. If those conditions were met, jets could be destroyed on every encounter. If those conditions were not met, pursuit was pointless. The key insight was counterintuitive. Do not chase, intercept. Turn into attacking jets to disrupt their firing runs. Never pursue beyond the bomber defense perimeter. The Me-262's very speed became its vulnerability when facing coordinated defense, because speed gave pilots limited time on target and forced them to take high deflection shots that were difficult to aim. By March 1945, as jet attacks intensified, Dregne refined his tactics further. The group began flying close escort to the bombers, keeping in flights and sections. The former tactic of having squadrons form a loose perimeter around the bomber boxes was abandoned. The new method permitted fighters to turn into attacking jets and drive them off before they broke through. Dregne was explicit about what his pilots must not do. Formations must not permit the maneuvers of the jets to draw them too far away from the bombers they are escorting. The jets, with their superior speed, could pull up and turn so swiftly back into the now unprotected bomber boxes, leaving the P-51 pilots far behind and helpless as defenders. The order was clear. If a jet attacks and runs, let it go. Your job is protecting the bombers, not chasing an aircraft you cannot catch. The moment you leave formation to pursue, you have already lost. The jet will be kilometers away before you realize your mistake, and the bombers you abandoned will be burning. This was not cowardice, this was mathematics, and for the pilots who obeyed it, it was the difference between coming home and dying in a pointless chase across the German sky. The vulnerable moment. Every machine has a weakness. For the Me-262, that weakness was the Junkers Jumo 004B engine that gave it such extraordinary speed. The Jumo 004 required 8 to 15 seconds to spool from idle to full power. Rapid throttle movements caused fuel surges and turbine temperature spikes that could destroy the engine instantly. This meant pilots could not simply push the throttle forward and accelerate like they could in a piston engine fighter. They had to nurse the engines carefully, bringing them up to power gradually, treating them like temperamental thoroughbreds rather than reliable workhorses. During takeoff, an Me-262 was nearly defenseless. It rolled down the runway at perhaps 150 miles per hour, engines screaming but unable to accelerate any faster without risking catastrophic failure. During landing approach, the situation was even worse. Pilots had to reduce speed to around 200 miles per hour, and if they spotted enemy fighters, they could not simply firewall the throttles and escape. They would have to wait those agonizing 8 to 15 seconds while their engines came up to power, and in aerial combat, 8 seconds is an eternity. The Royal Air Force discovered this vulnerability first. The Tempest-equipped No. 135 wing developed what they called rat scramble operations. When Me-262s were reported airborne, Tempest launched immediately and flew directly toward known jet bases. Rather than trying to intercept jets in flight, they waited near the airfields to catch them during landing approaches. The tactic worked brilliantly at first. Then the Germans adapted. Along the approach, corridors to jet bases like Rheinhopston, the Luftwaffe constructed over 150 emplacements of 20mm quadruple autocannon batteries. These flak lanes created killing zones that any Allied aircraft had to fly through to reach the landing jets. In a single week, 7 Tempests fell to Hopston flak. The rat scramble operations were scaled back dramatically, though selective interception attempts continued when conditions permitted. American pilots developed a different approach. Rather than waiting for jets to land, they targeted them during takeoff, when the aircraft was still slow, and the flak lanes were behind them rather than ahead. On October 7, 1944, Lieutenant Irwin Dregne of the 361st Fighter Group became the first pilot to destroy two Me 262s in a single mission. He waited above Acma Airfield until jets lifted off, then dove at over 400 miles per hour. Drew later described the engagement. He caught up with the second Me 262 when it was about 1,000 feet off the ground. He was indicating 450 miles per hour, and the jet aircraft could not have been going over 200. For those few seconds, the fastest aircraft in the world was slower than a Mustang in a dive. By April 1945, Colonel Dregne had formalized this into standard doctrine. Squadrons were ordered to arrive at known jet airfields 1 hour before bomber formations were scheduled to arrive. The 357's April 18th mission to Prague exemplified this approach. 54 Mustangs positioned themselves over German airfields and destroyed jets before they could even reach the bombers they were meant to attack. The hunters had found a way to hunt the unhuntable, not by chasing, but by waiting. The results spoke for themselves. On April 10, 1945, in what some historians would later call the Jet Massacre, 55 Me 262s launched against 1,232 bombers and 900 escorts. It was the largest jet operation of the war. 27 jets were lost according to German records, many to accidents during takeoff and landing, many more to Mustangs waiting exactly where Dregne's doctrine predicted they would be vulnerable. 21 American pilots received credit for Me, 62 kills that single day. The jets destroyed only 10 bombers. The mathematics had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The Tuskegee Airmen demonstrated that Dregne's tactics worked even under the most demanding conditions. On March 24, 1945, pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group, the Red Tails, flew the war's longest escort mission, 1,600 miles round trip to Berlin and back. Over the German capital, 3 pilots were credited with downing Me 262s, though some historians have questioned whether all the aircraft involved were correctly identified in the chaos of combat. First, Lieutenant Roscoe Brown explained their approach years later. They knew the German jets were faster than they were. Instead of going directly after them, they went away from them and then turned into their blind spots. Brown attacked Oberleutnant Franz Kolb from the 8 o'clock position, hitting his jet and forcing the German pilot to bail out at 24,500 feet. Whatever the precise aircraft types involved, it was textbook execution of the doctrine that Colonel Dregne had developed. Do not chase. Position. Intercept. Destroy. If you are finding this exploration of Second World War aviation history interesting, consider subscribing to the channel. It takes just a moment and helps us continue producing content like this. Now, let us examine what it was like to fly the Me 262 from the German perspective. Angels pushing. Adolf Galland was Germany's youngest general. At 31 years old, he commanded all Luftwaffe fighter forces as General der Jagdflieger. He had 104 aerial victories to his name. He had flown against the British in the Battle of Britain and the Americans over the Reich. He thought he knew what flying was. On May 22, 1943, Galland climbed into the cockpit of a Me 262 for the first time. When he landed, he uttered the words that would define the jet age. He said it was as though angels were pushing. Galland immediately grasped the aircraft's potential. In his hands, this was not merely a fast aeroplane, this was a war-winning weapon. He calculated, perhaps optimistically, that with 300 Me 262s operating as pure fighters, Germany could destroy 200 bombers per day. If sustained for even a fortnight, daylight bombing would have to be halted entirely. The air war would shift back in Germany's favour. It was a compelling theory. Whether it could have worked in practice remained untested. He spent the next 18 months fighting to make this happen. His enemy was not the Americans. His enemy was Adolf Hitler. On November 26, 1943, Hitler witnessed an Me 262 demonstration. He asked Reich Marshal Hermann Göring whether the aircraft could carry bombs. Willy Messerschmitt, eager to please, said yes. Theoretically, it could carry 500 to 1,000 kilograms. Hitler seized on this. Germany needed a fast bomber to attack the inevitable Allied invasion beaches. The Me 262 would become his Schnellbomber, his fast bomber that could strike where propeller aircraft could not survive. On May 23, 1944, when Hitler learned that all Me 262s were being built as fighters, witnesses described one of his worst tantrums of the war. He ordered immediate conversion to the bomber role. Göring decreed that no one could even call it a fighter. It was to be referred to only as a blitz bomber. The consequences were immediate and severe. 2 of the 4 cannons were removed to make room for a bomb sight. Bomb loads reduced the aircraft's speed by 120 miles per hour, bringing it within reach of Allied fighters. Fighter pilot training halted entirely. Galland argued. Galland pleaded. Galland was eventually stripped of his command in January 1945 after what became known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt, when senior Luftwaffe officers confronted Göring about the misuse of their aircraft. Modern historians debate how much Hitler's interference actually delayed the Me-262 program. Recent analysis suggests the bomber directive delayed the first dedicated fighter unit by weeks rather than months. The primary bottleneck was always engine production, not Hitler's obsession with bombs. RAF intelligence noted that if anything, the Germans initiated production of the aircraft rather too early. In the spring of 1944, Me-262 airframes were coming off assembly lines before engines were ready to power them. The truth lies somewhere between the legend of Hitler's blunder and the logistics of industrial collapse. Germany was running out of strategic materials. Nickel, cobalt, and molybdenum were essential for heat-resistant turbine alloys. Germany had none. The Jumo 004 engines that emerged from factories used mild steel with aluminium coating instead of proper alloys. They lasted 10 to 25 hours before requiring overhaul. Maximum engine life was 35 hours before the turbine blades failed entirely. Germany built 1,430 to 1,443 Me-262s during the war, yet never more than 50 to 60 were combat ready simultaneously. You cannot win an air war with 50 aircraft against an enemy who launches 1,000 bomber raids with 700 fighter escorts. The numbers reveal a weapon that arrived too late and fell apart too quickly. German records show that more Me-262s were destroyed on the ground or lost to mechanical failure than were shot down in aerial combat. Ground attacks by Allied fighters accounted for roughly 34% of all losses. Engine failure and technical problems claimed another 15%. Accidents during takeoff and landing took 14% more. Only 9 to 15% of Me-262s were actually shot down by Allied fighters in the air. The pilots who flew them understood the fragility of their machines. Every takeoff was a gamble, every landing was a prayer. The engines that gave them such extraordinary speed were also engines that could flame out without warning, that required constant nursing, that turned the simplest maneuvers into potential death sentences. German ground crews worked around the clock to keep the jets flying. They cannibalized parts from damaged aircraft. They improvised repairs with whatever materials they could find. They watched pilots taxi out, knowing that the engines might fail before the aircraft ever reached combat. The miracle was not that so few. Me-262s were combat ready. The miracle was that any were ready at all. The men who flew into history. Walter Nowotny was 23 years old when he became the first pilot in history to score 250 aerial victories. He had survived being shot down and spending 3 days adrift in the Baltic Sea in 1941, kept alive only by a cork life jacket and sheer determination. After his rescue, according to squadron legend, he developed a superstition. He always wore the same pair of trousers he had worn during that mission, his victory pants. Whether the story is literally true matters less than what it reveals about how fighter pilots processed the randomness of survival. In October 1944, Nowotny took command of Commando. Nowotny, the world's first operational jet fighter unit. The assignment was supposed to be a reward for his achievements. It became his death sentence. On November 8, 1944, Galland was visiting the unit when American bombers appeared on radar. Nowotny rushed to his Me-262, but in his haste, he had forgotten his lucky trousers. His engines refused to start. Ground crew worked frantically while Nowotny sat in the cockpit watching other jets take off without him. Finally, the engines caught. He took off late, alone, without wingmen. He radioed claiming his 257th and 258th victories. Then his voice came through again, strained with the particular calm of a pilot who knows he is dying. Engine damaged. Returning on one engine. P-51 Mustangs caught him on approach, slow and vulnerable in exactly the way the rat scramble tactics had anticipated. His final transmission was 3 words: I am on fire. Galland watched from the command post as an Me-262 emerged from the clouds in a vertical dive. It struck the ground and exploded. Recovery teams found only Nowotny's left hand and fragments of his knight's cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. Johannes Steinhoff had survived 176 aerial victories by April 1945. He had learned to fly jets despite the dangers, had become one of JV-44's most experienced pilots. His luck ran out on an airfield in Bavaria. On April 18, 1945, his Me-262 hit a poorly patched bomb crater during takeoff. The undercarriage sheared off. The aircraft slid across the ground on its belly, sparks igniting fuel vapor. Then fire erupted throughout the cockpit. Steinhoff carried 24 R-4M rockets under his wings. As he struggled to escape the burning wreckage, they began to cook off. He later described the moment. He remembered popping the canopy and jumping out, flames all around him. The explosions continued, knocking him down as he tried to run away. He could not describe the pain. He survived, barely. 2 years in hospital, 69 reconstructive surgeries, his eyelids had burned away entirely. In 1969, a British surgeon rebuilt them using skin grafted from his forearm. Despite permanent disfigurement that left his face a mask of scar tissue, Steinhoff rose to command NATO's military committee from 1971 to 1974. He never flew again. Heinz Behr achieved what no other pilot would match: 16 aerial victories in the Me-262, the highest score of any jet pilot in history. His total career victories numbered 220. In the final weeks of the war, flying with JV-44, he demonstrated what the Me-262 could do in the hands of a true expert. But even Behr could not overcome the mathematics. 16 victories meant 16 Allied aircraft destroyed. The Allies lost thousands per month and built more to replace them. Individual excellence could not compensate for industrial collapse. The jet aces of the Luftwaffe represented the finest pilots Germany could produce, men who had survived years of combat, who had mastered the most demanding aircraft ever built, who pushed themselves and their machines to the absolute limit of what was possible. 28 German pilots achieved 5 or more victories in jet aircraft, qualifying as jet aces. Combined, they destroyed perhaps 200 Allied aircraft. It was a remarkable achievement. It changed nothing. The American factories that built B-17s and B-24s and P-51s produced more aircraft in a single month than the entire Me-262 program destroyed in a year. The mathematics were insurmountable. Germany could produce heroes. The Allies produced industrial might. Industrial Might 1, the Squadron of Experts. After his dismissal in January 1945, Galland did not sulk in retirement. He formed Jagdverband 44, the Squadron of Experts, assembling Germany's most decorated aces for one final stand. The roster read like a hall of fame of aerial combat. Adolf Galland himself, 104 victories. Johannes Steinhoff, 176 victories. Heinz Behr, 220 victories. Gerhard Barkhorn, 301 victories, Germany's second highest scoring ace of the war. Guenther Luetzow, 108 victories. Combined, the pilots of JV-44 had destroyed over 1,000 Allied aircraft in their careers. They never had more than 6 jets operational at any one time. The unit flew from Munich-Riem airfield, their Me-262s hidden in the surrounding forests and towed to the runway by oxen to save fuel. In 1 month of operations, they claimed 40 to 55 victories while losing only a handful of aircraft in combat. The exchange ratio proved Galland's thesis. With proper numbers, the Me-262 could have changed the air war. But proper numbers never came. Fuel was rationed to the point where training flights were impossible. Replacement pilots arrived having never flown a jet. Spare parts existed in theory but not in practice. The engines that should have lasted 25 hours were failing after 10 because quality control had collapsed along with everything else. On April 26, 1945, Galland flew his final combat mission. He found American bombers and attacked, destroying one before P-47 Thunderbolts caught him from behind. First Lieutenant James Finnegan's bullets shattered his instrument panel and hit his right knee. The right engine trailed flame. Then the left engine was hit as well. Somehow, Galland nursed the dying aircraft to the ground. He crash-landed in a field, his war finally over. He would spend years as a consultant to the Argentine Air Force, then return to Germany as a businessman. He never flew in combat again. On May 4, 1945, as American forces approached Munich, the surviving pilots of JV-44 made their final decision. They would not surrender their jets intact. One by one, they dropped grenades into the engine intakes of every Me-262 they could not fly out. The explosions echoed across the airfield like funeral salutes. The Galland circus was finished. The harvest of secrets. Before the last Me-262 was destroyed, American intelligence was already racing to capture as many as possible. Operation Lusty, an acronym for Luftwaffe Secret Technology, began on April 22, 1945. Colonel Harold Watson assembled a team that would become known as Watson's Whizzes. Their mission was simple: find German jets, secure them, ship them to America before the Soviets could grab them. At Lechfeld Airfield, Watson's team located 9 intact Me-262s. They recruited German test pilots Karl Bau and Ludwig Hoffmann, convincing them that cooperation was better than Soviet captivity. The German pilots taught Americans to fly jets in a matter of days. The aircraft was shipped to the United States aboard HMS Reaper. Within months, they were being tested at Wright Field, their secrets extracted by American engineers desperate to understand what made them fly so fast. Captain Eric Brown of the Royal Navy's enemy aircraft flight at RAE Farnborough flew more types of aircraft than any pilot in history. He tested 53 different German designs, including the Me-262. His assessment was characteristically blunt. He called it a blitzkrieg aircraft. You whack in at your bomber. It was never meant to be a dogfighter. Brown identified the jet's true limitation. It was designed for slashing attacks against bombers, not prolonged combat against fighters. Its speed was an advantage only when used correctly. In a turning fight, the Me-262 bled energy rapidly and became vulnerable. The American order not to chase was tactically sound. But if American pilots could force a jet into a turning fight, They could win. The technology transfer that followed shaped the Cold War. North American aviation, designers of the P-51 Mustang, studied Me-262 swept-wing research extensively when developing the F-86 Sabre. The actual Me-262 automatic leading-edge slap mechanism was installed in the first 7 F-86 prototypes. A complete Me-262 wing was shipped from Wright Field for analysis. Soviet designers followed a parallel path. Captured German documents and wind tunnel models informed the development of the MiG-15. The 35-degree wing sweep of the Soviet fighter matches exactly what German engineers had proposed for advanced Me-262 derivatives. The engines found new life as well. Soviet-manufactured RD-10 engines were direct copies of the Jumo 004. They powered the Yakovlev Yak-15, the Soviet Union's first jet fighter. The RD-20, copied from the BMW 003, powered the MiG-9. Within 5 years of the war's end, every major air force in the world was flying jets that owed their existence to the Me-262. The aircraft that had terrified American bomber crews had become the foundation of American air power. The irony was profound. American pilots in Korea flew F-86 Sabres against Soviet-built MiG-15s. Both aircraft traced their lineage directly to the Me-262. The swept wings, the axial flow engines, the heavy cannon armament that defined jet-age combat, all of it began in German factories and wind tunnels. The aircraft that American pilots had been forbidden to chase had given birth to the aircraft American pilots would fly for decades. Even the tactics survived. The principles Colonel Dregne developed to fight, Me-262s, the emphasis on position over pursuit, on coordinated defense rather than individual aggression, on catching fast aircraft at their most vulnerable moments, these principles shaped fighter doctrine throughout the Cold War. Every jet pilot who learned to fight in the 1950s and 60s was studying lessons first, written in blood over Germany in 1945. The Germans who designed and flew the Me-262 knew they had created something revolutionary. They also knew they had created it too late. The aircraft that could have changed the war in 1943 arrived in numbers only in 1945, when Germany was already dying. It was the right weapon at the wrong time, a glimpse of what might have been rather than what was. The mathematics of what if. Adolf Galland went to his grave believing Germany could have won the air war. With just 300 Me-262s operating as fighters, he claimed, Germany could have destroyed 200 bombers per day. If sustained for a fortnight, daylight bombing would have collapsed. The mathematics argue otherwise. March 18, 1945 saw the largest Me-262 engagement of the war. 37 jets launched against 1,221 bombers and their escorts. The result was 12 bombers destroyed, less than 1% of the attacking force. Even at favourable kill ratios, the absolute numbers remained insufficient. The 8th Air Force was launching 1,000 bomber raids, with escorts exceeding 700 fighters. To inflict the kind of casualties that would force a halt to operations, Germany would have needed not 300 jets, but 3,000, along with the fuel to fly them, the pilots to man them, and the engines to keep them running. None of those requirements could be met. German oil production had collapsed under Allied bombing. Pilot training had been cut to the point where new aviators arrived at units with fewer than 100 flying hours total. Engine production never exceeded 600 Jumo 004s per month, and each aircraft required 2 engines that lasted only weeks before failing. The Me-262 was a revolutionary weapon trapped in a dying nation. It could not save Germany because nothing could save Germany by 1945. What remains? Between 12 and 14 original Me-262s survive today in various states of completeness, depending on how restorers count partial airframes and composite reconstructions. At the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, you can see Yellow 7, the aircraft flown by Heinz Arnold, who achieved 42 victories during the war. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, sits Screamin' Mimi, recovered and restored after decades of neglect. The Deutsches Museum in Munich displays the aircraft of Hans Guido Muttke, who may or may not have been the first pilot to break the sound barrier in a dive. Other examples survive in Australia, South Africa, and scattered across Europe and America. Some are complete aircraft, some are careful reconstructions using original components. The line between survivor and replica blurs when you consider how many parts have been replaced over 8 decades of preservation. For those who want to see an Me-262 fly, modern replicas offer the next best thing. The Me-262 project, later known as Legend Flyers, built 4 flying reproductions, powered by General Electric CJ6, 10 engines concealed within authentic-looking Jumo nacelles. The Collins Foundation operates one from Houston. The Military Aviation Museum in Virginia Beach is working to return another to the skies. These replicas cannot truly capture what it was like to face the original. They are too reliable. Their engines do not fail after 20 hours. Their pilots do not face flak lanes and American fighters waiting to kill them during landing. They are museum pieces that move, tributes to an aircraft that changed history without changing the war. The sound that echoed forward. That pilot from Kansas who was ordered not to chase the Me-262 survived the war. He returned home, married, raised children, and lived long enough to see American jets break the sound barrier. He lived long enough to see the F-86 Sabre, descended from the aircraft he was forbidden to pursue, dominate the skies over Korea. The tactical lessons his commanders learned in 1945 shaped air combat for generations. Speed is not everything. Position matters more than velocity. The aircraft that chooses when to fight will usually win. These principles, forged in desperate encounters with German jets, became doctrine at every fighter pilot school in the Western world. The Me-262 killed approximately 150 Allied aircraft, far fewer than German propaganda claimed, far fewer than its potential suggested. It arrived too late, in too few numbers, with engines too fragile to sustain operations. It was a glimpse of the future trapped in the wreckage of the past. Johannes Steinhoff, his face rebuilt by surgeons, his body marked by fire, understood this better than anyone. Even if the jets were built in greater numbers, he reflected, we did not have the trained pilots, or even the fuel. It was too late in the war, and we could not win. However, if we had had the jets in 1943, things would have been different. But that was not to be. That was our fate. The Me-262 was the aircraft American pilots were ordered never to chase. That order was not cowardice. It was wisdom. It was recognition that some enemies cannot be defeated by pursuit, only by patience, position, and the terrible arithmetic of industrial war. The Germans built the future first. The Allies made sure that future belonged to them. Somewhere in a museum, Yellow 7 sits in silence, its engines cold, its guns empty, its wars long over. Schoolchildren walk past without understanding what they are seeing. They are looking at the moment aviation changed forever, the moment propellers became obsolete, the moment a young pilot from Kansas learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not chase. The Angels stopped pushing a long time ago, but the echo of their wings shaped everything that came after.